At the threshold of 174 AD, the Danube front appears as a vast line of tension, apparently quiet but in reality full of a latent violence that no one among the Roman commanders dares to underestimate. The previous year, 173, was not a simple preparatory chapter, but rather a phase of attrition and adjustment that left profound marks on both the Roman army and the barbarian populations. The great waves of invasions that had devastated Noricum, Pannonia, and Moesia in previous years had been repelled, but not annihilated. What remained was a more subtle, less spectacular war, fought with forced marches, fort building, sudden skirmishes, and constant pressure on men's material and psychological resources. Marcus Aurelius, who had never considered the Danube conflict as a simple punitive expedition, entered the new year with the awareness that the time for improvised reactions was over. 174 was to be the year of the transformation of military victory into stable control. During 173, the Roman army had consolidated its positions along the middle and upper Danube, rebuilding a defensive line that was no longer just a border, but an offensive platform. The legions, strengthened after the losses suffered in the hardest years of the war, had regained confidence in themselves. It was no longer a question of departments caught by surprise by sudden incursions, but of an army that had learned to know the enemy, the terrain, the seasonal rhythm of operations. The winter of 173 to 174, harsh as often happened in those regions, had imposed an only apparent pause. In the castras and advanced camps they worked tirelessly. The palisades were repaired, food was accumulated, the recruits were trained, many of whom now came from the same Danubian provinces, men accustomed to the cold, the forests, the swollen rivers. The war, in other words, was becoming local, entrenched, and this was a decisive advantage for Rome. On the barbarian side, the situation was much more uncertain. The Marcomanni and Quadi, who had represented the heart of the German threat, emerged from 173 profoundly weakened. Their political structures, based on a delicate balance between tribal leaders and warrior consensus, had suffered harsh blows. Villages devastated, crops destroyed, leaders forced to flee or submit. However, this very fragmentation made the front unstable. There was no single enemy to face, but a constellation of groups, some inclined to surrender, others ready to fight to the last, others still tempted by the idea of moving, migrating, seeking new lands away from Roman pressure. The War of 174 was also born from here, from this impossibility of ending the conflict with a single decisive blow. The Sarmatian Iazyges, stationed further east, carefully observed the evolution of events. In 173 they had not been the main target of the operations, but they understood that the stabilization of the German front would inevitably lead Rome to turn against them. Their cavalry, mobile and fearsome, represented a different threat from that of the Germans, and precisely for this reason the Roman army had begun to study it, to adapt its tactics, to prepare a response that was not improvised. This is also part of the legacy of 173, the awareness that the war was not ending, but changing shape. Marcus Aurelius, during the previous year, had strengthened the command structure. The legionary legates and provincial governors were no longer simple executors of orders, but part of a coordinated system, in which information circulated with surprising speed for the time. Reports, messengers, scouts, everything contributed to creating a mental map of the front that allowed the emperor to make informed decisions. It is no coincidence that, already at the end of 173, a possible advance beyond the Danube was spoken of not as a dream, but as a concrete option. This idea was not born in a vacuum. It was born from accumulated experience, from the perception that the river border, as it had been conceived for centuries, was no longer sufficient to guarantee security. The Roman army entered 174 with considerable numerical strength, but above all with hardened discipline. The legions had learned to fight in a hostile environment, made up of dense forests, swamps, and hills that were difficult to control. They had also learned to live with a war that did not offer major pitched battles, but a continuous sequence of minor clashes, ambushes, chases. This type of conflict wears more slowly, but profoundly, and the fact that the Roman army managed to maintain control of it is one of the clearest indicators of the change that occurred in 173. As the new year begins, there are no triumphalist proclamations or illusions of imminent peace. There is rather a tense calm, a sort of operational silence that precedes big decisions. Rome has learned that haste is the enemy of lasting victory. The barbarian populations, for their part, perceive that time is working against them. Each passing season strengthens the Roman presence, making it more difficult to overturn the balance. 174 AD was therefore born as a year full of expectations, built slowly, layer after layer, in the mud of the camps and in the interminable marches of 173. It is on this basis, solid and at the same time fragile, that the decisive events of the following months will be grafted, when the war, from a defensive necessity, will begin to openly transform into an imperial project. During 174 AD, the war on the Danube definitively ceased to be a sum of local emergencies and took on the contours of a unitary strategic plan, guided directly by the figure of Marcus Aurelius. The emperor is not a distant sovereign, who governs through dispatches and abstract delegations. He is present in the theater of operations, follows their rhythms, knows their material difficulties, and above all perceives their deepest political meaning. His strategy for 174 was not born from the impulse of the moment, but from a long reflection matured in the previous years, during a war that forced him to confront the fragility of the empire and the need to rethink its borders. At this point of the conflict, Marcus Aurelius is aware that it is not enough to push the barbarians back across the river. It is necessary to prevent them from being able to reorganize, return, strike again. The imperial command is therefore structured on two complementary levels. On the one hand, Marcus Aurelius maintains control of fundamental decisions, establishing objectives, priorities, and general lines of action. On the other, it entrusts operational execution to experienced generals, chosen not only for their rank but for their ability to adapt to irregular warfare. This balance between centralization and autonomy is one of the key elements of the 174 strategy. The emperor knows that the distance between the various sectors of the front makes minute-by-minute direction impossible, but he demands that every local movement is part of an overall vision. War must not produce isolated victories, but rather a cumulative, irreversible result. One of the main objectives of the year is the definitive shattering of the barbarian coalitions. It is no longer a question of facing enemy armies deployed in an open field, a rare and risky event, but of affecting the ability of the tribes to coordinate, to support the war effort, to maintain a recognized leadership. In this sense, 174 is the year in which the war openly takes on a political character. Every expedition, every advance, every negotiation has the aim of isolating the most hostile groups, pushing the hesitant ones into submission and demonstrating that Rome does not intend to abandon the conquered ground. Marcus Aurelius understands that deterrence, in a context like the Danube one, arises from the continuity of the military presence rather than from single acts of force. Logistics becomes a central element of the strategy. The emperor and his commanders know that without an efficient supply network the army risks turning into a vulnerable mass. For this reason, at the beginning of 174, the communication routes along the river and towards the interior were strengthened, using the Danube as the main artery but combining it with an increasingly dense land network. Warehouses are deployed to support prolonged operations, reducing dependence on long, easily attackable convoys. This attention to logistics, often invisible in the most epic narratives of the war, is one of the factors that allows Rome to maintain the initiative. On a military level, Marcus Aurelius favors a strategy of constant pressure. It does not seek a decisive clash at any cost, but a sequence of actions that force the enemy to react, to consume resources, to expose itself. Legions are deployed flexibly, often divided into mobile columns capable of moving quickly, supported by auxiliary troops who know the terrain and how the barbarians fight. This combination of heavy force and mobility is a direct response to the characteristics of Danube warfare, where the enemy avoids direct confrontation and exploits knowledge of the environment. The personal presence of Marcus Aurelius exerts a profound influence on the morale of the army. The sources, although filtered by rhetoric, agree in presenting him as a respected commander, not so much for spectacular gestures but for his ability to share the hardships of war. His figure embodies the idea of an emperor who does not ask his soldiers for sacrifices that he is not willing to bear himself. In a long and exhausting conflict, this aspect takes on an enormous political value. It strengthens the loyalty of the troops and reduces the risk of internal tensions, always possible when campaigns last for years far from Rome. The 174 strategy also includes a calibrated use of diplomacy. Marcus Aurelius does not consider submission a purely military act, but a process that must be consolidated through agreements, hostages, promises of protection. This approach, far from being a sign of weakness, reflects a deep understanding of tribal dynamics. A barbarian leader who accepts an agreement with Rome becomes an element of stability, but also a potential target for his rivals. For this reason, the emperor tries to build a system of relationships that makes it convenient for these local elites to maintain loyalty. This too is strategy, although fought with words and gifts rather than swords. In the overall design of 174, the idea of overcoming the purely defensive logic clearly emerges. Marcus Aurelius begins to conceive the Danube no longer as an insurmountable limit, but as a starting line. This vision does not yet translate into formal decisions, but it guides operational choices. The controlled advance, the creation of fortified points across the river, the desire to impose a stable presence in territories that until recently were considered only passage areas. It is a strategy that looks to the immediate future, but which arises from the experience of the recent past, from the awareness that any retreat is interpreted by the barbarians as a sign of weakness. Thus, while 174 AD took shape, the war entered a new phase. It is no longer a struggle to survive the invasion, but a confrontation to decide who will control the space beyond the traditional border. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and emperor, guides this transformation with a prudence that does not exclude audacity. His strategy does not promise a quick victory, but aims to make victory inevitable, built day after day through thoughtful decisions, military discipline and a political vision that transcends the individual clash. In this balance between firmness and measure, the face of the imperial command emerges in 174, a year in which war becomes, more than ever, a conscious instrument of the Roman project. In 174 AD, one of the most significant events of the entire Danube conflict did not manifest itself as a great pitched battle, but as a targeted operation, full of political and symbolic implications. The capture of Ariogaesus, a leading figure among the Quadi, and one of the main points of reference of the Germanic resistance. In a war that is now fought both on a military level and on that of prestige and authority, this episode takes on a value that goes far beyond the elimination of a single adversary. Ariogaesus is not just a tribal leader. He is a political node, a catalyst of consensus, a man whose presence holds different and often rival groups together. Striking it means striking at the very heart of the Quadi's ability to present themselves as credible interlocutors, both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. The sources do not give us a detailed account of the operation, and this silence is partly eloquent. The capture of Ariogaesus did not occur in a head-on clash, but as the result of prolonged military pressure, of a strategic encirclement which progressively reduced the possibilities of escape and maneuver. The Roman army, now master of the terrain and armed with an efficient information network, manages to identify the movements of the Quadic leader, predict his choices, tighten the circle without offering him the opportunity to transform the escape into a heroic gesture. In this sense, the capture of Ariogaesus is the fruit of a war that learned to be patient, to strike when the enemy is isolated, deprived of the support that had allowed him to resist in previous years. Ariogaesus is taken alive, and it is a detail that is anything but secondary. Marcus Aurelius and his commanders perfectly understand the value of a prisoner of such stature. His capture represents a tangible demonstration of Roman superiority, but also an instrument of pressure on the remaining barbarian elites. A defeated and captured chief, exhibited as a prisoner, is worth more than many burned villages. It's proof that no location, no matter how protected or remote, is truly safe. At the same time, the fact that Ariogaesus is not immediately executed indicates a precise political choice. Rome wants to show itself as master of the fate of its enemies, capable of punishing but also of deciding when and how to do so. The effect of the capture spread rapidly among the Germanic populations. In a context in which power is based on personal prestige and the ability to guarantee protection and loot, the fall of a charismatic leader produces a void that is difficult to fill. The alliance networks built around Ariogaesus begin to crumble. Some groups try to negotiate, others withdraw, still others attempt desperate resistance, now lacking coordination. The War of 174, which was already tending to fragment the barbarian front, found a decisive accelerator in this event. There is no longer a single point of reference, and this makes it easier for Rome to manage the conflict sector by sector, without risking a sudden recomposition of the enemy forces. From the Roman point of view, the capture of Ariogaesus is interpreted as confirmation that the strategy adopted is working. This is not a stroke of luck, but the result of consistent pressure, exerted on multiple levels. Marcus Aurelius, who carefully follows the evolution of the situation, immediately understands the political value of the event. Ariogaesus becomes a symbol of the new phase of the war, the one in which Rome does not simply react, but imposes the conditions of confrontation. The prisoner is removed from the theater of operations, probably to prevent his use as a reference figure or as a martyr, and destined for detention which definitively removes him from the Danube scene. This too is a gesture full of meaning. The defeated enemy is separated from his land, deprived of the possibility of fueling new resistance. The episode also had repercussions within the Roman army. In a long and arduous war, the capture of a high-ranking enemy leader represents a psychological turning point. It reinforces the belief that the end of the conflict is not an illusion, but a concrete prospect. The troops see the result of the sacrifices made, the marches and the privations materialize. This strengthening of morale is an element that Marcus Aurelius does not underestimate. In a context in which war also depends on the ability to maintain internal cohesion, every sign of success takes on strategic weight. On the barbarian side, however, the capture of Ariogaesus fuels a climate of uncertainty and fear. The perception that Rome is able to selectively target the most important leaders undermines confidence in the possibility of prolonged resistance. Some local leaders begin to consider submission not as a dishonorable surrender, but as a rational choice to safeguard their group. Others, on the contrary, reacted with gestures of sudden violence, attempts to strike Roman outposts or supply lines, in a sort of final affirmation of autonomy. These reactions are also part of the Roman calculation. An enemy that acts in a disorganized way is easier to contain and neutralize. The capture of Ariogaesus, therefore, does not end the war, but profoundly changes its balance. It is an event that marks the transition from a phase of structured resistance to a phase of progressive dissolution of the enemy front. In 174 AD, this episode was part of a sequence of successes that strengthened the idea, increasingly widespread among the Romans, that final victory was within reach. It is not yet the time of solemn triumphs, but it is the moment in which war loses its unpredictable character and takes the form of a controlled process. Ariogaesus, once again feared, becomes the tangible sign of this transformation, proof that even the pillars of barbarian resistance can fall, one after the other, under the weight of a patient and implacable strategy. During 174 AD, while military operations continued along the entire Danube front, a formal act but full of profound meaning sanctioned the Roman perception of a turning point now complete: the Seventh Imperial Acclamation of Marcus Aurelius. This is not a simple ritual gesture, nor an empty formula repeated by custom. In the Roman army, the acclamation is the collective recognition of a concrete success, gained in the field, and represents a moment in which the community of soldiers takes the floor, recognizing the commander as the guarantor of victory and common salvation. In 174, this acclamation arises from a sum of events which, put together, paint a picture of clear Roman superiority, despite the absence of a single and definitive decisive battle. The context in which the seventh acclamation matures is that of a war that has changed its face. The great threats of the recent past have been broken, the barbarian coalitions appear fragmented, and the strategic initiative is firmly in Roman hands. The capture of Ariogaesus had a disruptive effect, but it is not an isolated episode. It is the symbol of a series of coordinated successes, controlled advances, methodically conducted operations. The army clearly perceives that the risk of a sudden collapse of the front, so feared in previous years, has now been averted. This collective perception is the emotional and political basis on which the acclamation is based. Unlike what happens in other contexts, the acclamation of 174 is not the result of sudden enthusiasm or a spectacular victory. Rather, it is the recognition of a leadership that was able to transform a chaotic war into a manageable conflict. The soldiers acclaim Marcus Aurelius as imperator not only for what he conquered, but for what he avoided: disastrous defeats, mutinies, disintegration of the army. In this sense, the acclamation reflects a political maturity of the army itself, aware that stability is a form of victory as much as loot or immediate glory. From an institutional point of view, the seventh acclamation further strengthens the position of Marcus Aurelius within the empire. Although far from Rome, engaged in a border war, the emperor continues to govern a vast state, crossed by economic and social tensions. Every military recognition helps to consolidate his authority, to demonstrate that imperial power is not paralyzed by the physical absence from the capital. The news of the acclamation, transmitted through official and informal channels, reached Rome as confirmation that the choice to keep the emperor on the front was not only justified, but necessary. The propaganda aspect of the acclamation should not be underestimated. In an era in which images and words circulate slowly but with great symbolic force, the title of imperator repeated for the seventh time becomes a clear message, aimed at both subjects and enemies. For provincial populations, it is the guarantee that the empire is able to defend itself. For the barbarian tribes, it is an unmistakable signal that Rome is not tired, nor close to retreat. The acclamation, therefore, is not just an internal act within the army, but an element of the psychological warfare that accompanies military operations. It is significant that this recognition occurs while the war is still ongoing. Marcus Aurelius does not wait for the formal conclusion of the conflict to accept the acclamation, because he knows that its value lies precisely in the ability to support future action. The title of imperator strengthens his authority over subordinate commanders, facilitates the coordination of operations, and makes any form of dissent more difficult. In a long war, in which accumulated fatigue can erode discipline, this symbolic strengthening of the supreme command has a non-negligible practical importance. On the barbaric side, the news of the acclamation fits into a climate already marked by mistrust. Tribal leaders understand the language of prestige and symbolic strength no less than the Romans. Knowing that the army acclaims its commander means recognizing that the hopes of dividing Rome from within, of exploiting tensions or rivalries, are now reduced to a minimum. The war, which in the past had seen moments of Roman uncertainty, now appears as a process guided by a united political will. This helps push some communities toward surrender or negotiation, while others prepare for desperate resistance, aware that time is no longer in their favor. The seventh imperial acclamation also fits into the personal dimension of Marcus Aurelius. A Stoic philosopher, not inclined to show off glory, the emperor accepts this recognition not as a celebration of himself, but as a necessity of the role he plays. The sources suggest a certain sobriety in the way the event is managed, without rhetorical excesses or theatrical gestures. This attitude helps to strengthen the image of a command based on responsibility rather than personal ambition, an image that finds a positive echo among soldiers and imperial officials. In the overall picture of 174 AD, the seventh acclamation does not represent a point of arrival, but an intermediate step, a stage that certifies the advanced state of the victory without declaring it concluded. It is the sign that Rome has regained control of the situation and that the army recognizes Marcus Aurelius as the guarantor of this control. The war continues, the difficulties have not disappeared, but the center of gravity of the conflict has definitively shifted. With this acclamation, the year takes on a precise face, that of an empire which, after having risked a lot, finds itself once again capable of imposing its own order, not only with the force of arms, but with the authority of a recognized and shared command. In 174 AD, while the war seems to be progressively turning in Rome's favor, perhaps the most revealing element of the change taking place is not an armed clash, but the physical transformation of the territory beyond the Danube. The Roman army no longer limited itself to striking and retreating, nor to exclusively garrisoning the southern bank of the river. Instead, it began to occupy, organize, and stabilize a space that until a few years earlier had been considered alien to the imperial order. The creation and strengthening of the Roman outposts in barbarian territory represent one of the most delicate and significant steps of the year, because they translate into permanent structures that desire for control which, until that moment, had been above all military and contingent. The outposts do not arise suddenly or as an isolated initiative of individual commanders. They are the result of careful planning, gained through the experience of previous campaigns. Rome has learned that the simple retreat of the enemy does not guarantee security. The defeated tribes can reorganize, strike again, exploit the same penetration routes already used. For this reason, in 174, the strategy envisaged breaking the territorial continuity of the barbarian groups, occupying strategic nodes, controlling fords, hills, crossroads of tracks, grazing areas and areas from which incursions could start. Each outpost is an advanced sentry, but also a visible sign of the Roman presence. These installations take different forms, adapted to the context and function. In some cases these are actual forts, built according to the models of the Roman military tradition, with embankments, ditches, palisades and internal structures intended to house stable garrisons. In other cases they are advanced camps, less monumental but equally crucial, designed to support mobile operations and guarantee a safe reference point for moving columns. The choice of places is not random. The Romans favored positions that allowed a visual control of the surrounding territory and that were easily resupplied, often exploiting the Danube and its tributaries as communication routes. The construction of these outposts requires a significant logistical effort. The legions, already engaged in military operations, must dedicate men and resources to the construction of the structures, the transport of materials, and the securing of the surrounding areas. This work, apparently secondary to combat, is actually one of the most characteristic aspects of Roman warfare. Building means asserting control, transforming hostile space into an orderly space, making predictable what was previously uncertain. In 174 AD, the Roman army demonstrates once again that its strength does not lie only in the ability to win battles, but in the perseverance with which it knows how to consolidate the results obtained. The presence of the outposts profoundly changes the behavior of the local populations. For tribes that had already suffered defeats, the sight of stable, continuously manned Roman fortifications was an unmistakable signal. Rome did not intend to retreat once the campaign was over. This leads many groups to avoid direct confrontation and move elsewhere, contributing to the fragmentation of the barbarian front. Others, however, try to adapt to the new situation, initiating contacts, offering information, looking for a form of coexistence that will allow them to survive under the shadow of imperial power. These reactions are also part of the Roman calculation. A territory in which the enemy divides and reorients itself is easier to control than one in which there is compact resistance. From a military perspective, outposts serve a crucial function in ensuring the safety of troops on the move. They act as starting bases for reconnaissance, as shelters in case of sudden counterattacks, and as assembly points for dispersed units. In a war characterized by ambushes and rapid actions, the possibility of counting on a network of advanced garrisons significantly reduces operational risk. Furthermore, the outposts allow you to maintain constant pressure on the enemy, preventing him from reorganizing away from the Roman gaze. Every movement of the tribes is observed, every suspicious concentration reported, every attack attempt intercepted in advance. The creation of this advanced network also requires a reorganization of the army. Not all troops are intended for direct combat. Some units are permanently assigned to the defense and maintenance of outposts, others rotate periodically to avoid excessive attrition. This rotation system testifies to a remarkable organizational maturity, especially in a context far from the large infrastructures of the empire. Marcus Aurelius and his commanders understand that the stability of the front also depends on the ability to preserve the efficiency of the troops, preventing fatigue and isolation from compromising discipline. On a symbolic level, the outposts represent a declaration of intent. They materialize the idea that the border of the empire is not an immutable line, but a dynamic reality, which can advance when conditions allow. In 174 AD, this awareness begins to emerge with ever greater clarity. The fortifications beyond the Danube are not yet provinces, nor Roman cities in the strict sense, but they anticipate a possible future transformation. Each palisade planted in the barbarian terrain is a step towards a new configuration of imperial space. For the Roman army, living and operating in these outposts means facing a different dimension of war. It's no longer just about fighting, but about resisting the climate, the loneliness, the constant tension. The advanced garrisons are exposed to small attacks, sabotage attempts, and continuous psychological pressure. However, this very experience helps to strengthen the cohesion of the troops and create a sense of belonging to a mission that goes beyond the single clash. Defending an outpost means defending the very idea of the Roman presence beyond the river. In the context of 174 AD, the network of Roman outposts marks a point of no return. Even if the war is not yet over, the territory north of the Danube is no longer an indistinct and hostile space, but an area progressively structured according to Rome's military needs. This slow and arduous transformation is one of the main reasons why, at the end of the year, the empire can look to the future with cautious optimism. Without proclaiming definitive victories, Rome laid the material foundations of a deeper dominion, demonstrating that its strength lies not only in the ability to strike, but in the determination to stay. In 174 AD, while the Germanic front appears progressively contained and fragmented, Rome's strategic attention shifts decisively towards the east, where the Sarmatian Iazyges now represent the main factor of residual instability along the Middle Danube. The start of the campaign against them is not a sudden reaction, nor the fruit of a random opportunity, but the logical outcome of an evaluation process developed over time. The Iazyges, settled in the plain between the Tisza and the Danube, did not suffer the same systematic pressure inflicted on the Marcomanni and Quadi in previous years. This relative marginality has made them an attentive and prudent observer, but also a potential beneficiary of the weakening of others. In 174, Marcus Aurelius was aware that leaving this mobile force intact would mean accepting the idea of an incomplete peace, always exposed to the risk of new incursions. The Iazyges are not an enemy like the others. Their military power is not based on fortified settlements or stable territorial control, but on the extreme mobility of their cavalry. Light and heavy knights, capable of striking quickly and disappearing just as quickly, make the war against them profoundly different from that fought against the Germanic tribes. Rome knows this well. Previous experiences have shown how difficult it is to force the Sarmatians into a decisive clash. Precisely for this reason, the opening of the 174 campaign is preceded by careful tactical and logistical preparation, which aims to reduce the enemy's advantages and exploit its vulnerabilities. The Roman army, which had now acquired considerable experience in the Danubian War, adapted its deployment. The legions remain the core of the force, but their use is calibrated with greater care. Alongside them, auxiliary troops are taking on a growing role, in particular those with superior mobility and greater familiarity with mounted combat. It is not a question of simply imitating Sarmatian tactics, but of neutralizing them, forcing the Iazyges to fight in less favorable conditions. The terrain, in this sense, becomes a fundamental ally. Marshy areas, waterways, wooded areas are exploited to limit the freedom of movement of the enemy cavalry. The beginning of the campaign against the Iazyges is not marked by a single formal act, but by a series of coordinated movements that clearly indicate a change of priority. Roman troops advance along multiple directions, avoiding offering the enemy a single target. Already established outposts serve as support bases, allowing sustained operations to be supported without excessively exposing supply lines. This gradual approach reflects the prudence of Marcus Aurelius, who preferred to consolidate each step rather than risk a rapid and vulnerable advance. From a political point of view, the opening of the Iazygian front has a precise meaning. It demonstrates that Rome does not intend to limit itself to selective pacification, but aims at an overall stabilization of the Danube area. The Iazyges quickly understand that they can no longer remain on the sidelines of the conflict, hoping to benefit from the usury of others. Roman pressure forces them to react, but their options are limited. An open war against a now experienced and well-organized army entails enormous risks. Flight or dispersion, on the other hand, threatens the very cohesion of the group. This dilemma is one of the most immediate effects of the beginning of the campaign of 174. The first phases of the operations are characterized by small-scale clashes, aggressive reconnaissance, attempts to intercept the night bands before they can strike and retreat. These are not isolated episodes, but a real war of movement, in which every contact has informative as well as military value. The Romans study the reactions of the Iazyges, observe their times, methods of attack, and preferred directions. This systematic collection of information allows the strategy to be further refined, reducing the unpredictability that had made the Sarmatians so dangerous in the past. Marcus Aurelius carefully follows the development of this new phase of the conflict. The campaign against the Iazyges is not for him a marginal appendage, but an essential piece of the overall project. As long as the Sarmatian cavalry remains operational, any victory on the German front risks being nullified. The emperor is well aware that a lasting peace cannot be built on precarious balances, and that border security requires the neutralization of all major sources of instability. This vision, developed over the years of war, guides the choices of the 174 with a coherence that emerges more and more clearly. On the Iazygian side, the beginning of the Roman campaign is perceived as an existential threat. Their strength, based on mobility and the absence of fixed structures, risks becoming a weakness in the face of an enemy that advances methodically and does not abandon the conquered ground. Some groups attempt to avoid direct confrontation by moving further east or fragmenting further. Others choose to react with sudden attacks, in an attempt to demonstrate that the Sarmatian cavalry is still capable of striking. These reactions, however, fail to reverse the general trend. The initiative remains firmly in Roman hands. The campaign of 174 against the Iazyges thus takes the form of an intelligent war of attrition, in which every success, even minimal, contributes to narrowing the enemy's space for maneuver. There are not yet great battles destined to enter the collective memory, but a sequence of actions which, added together, produce a cumulative effect. Rome does not seek immediate glory, but progressive control. This approach reflects the experience gained in previous years and the desire to avoid the mistakes of the past, when the rush to end the conflict had often paved the way for new crises. In the overall picture of 174 AD, the beginning of the campaign against the Iazyges marks a decisive expansion of the Roman strategic horizon. War is no longer confined to responding to the most obvious threats, but aims to eliminate the very conditions that make them possible. With this choice, Marcus Aurelius takes the Danube conflict to a higher level, transforming it more and more clearly into a project to redefine the balance of power in Central Eastern Europe. It is a risky but coherent step, which confirms that 174 is not a year of simple management of the existing situation, but rather a turning point, in which Rome decides to push the advantage it has gained to the end. During 174 AD, the war on the Danube entered a phase in which the clashes, although lacking a single and decisive battle, multiplied and took on a systematic character, clearly revealing the Roman organizational superiority and, at the same time, the growing desperation of the enemies. It is a year in which combat is not concentrated in a single theater, but is distributed along a broad and fragmented front, made up of controlled advances, sudden counterattacks, pursuits, and containment actions. Every movement of the Roman army is calculated to maintain the initiative, while the barbarian forces react unequally, often uncoordinated, incapable of reconstructing a common strategy. The clashes that follow one another in 174 do not all have the same intensity, but none are without meaning. On the German front, the resistance of the Marcomannic and Quadic groups manifested itself above all through rapid actions, attempts to hit isolated units, night raids against outposts or supply convoys. These attacks, while rarely decisive, forced the Romans to maintain a high level of alert and demonstrate that the enemy, although weakened, is not yet completely tamed. The Roman response was immediate and measured. Continuous patrols, rapid intervention columns, targeted punishments against the villages from which the incursions started. Every clash becomes an opportunity to further narrow the barbarians' room for maneuver. On several occasions, Roman forces intercepted moving Germanic groups, resulting in short but violent battles. These are not pitched battles, but clashes in which the discipline and cohesion of the legions make the difference. The barbarians, without a stable chain of command, fought ferociously but without coordination, while the Romans advanced in an orderly manner, exploiting their superiority in armament and formation. The consequences of these clashes are often decisive on a local level. Entire gangs are dispersed, leaders killed or captured, communication routes put under control. Every success, however limited, contributes to eroding the overall capacity for resistance. On the Eastern Front, against the Ariogaesus, the clashes took on a different physiognomy. Here the war is dominated by mobility, the speed of movement and the difficulty of forcing the enemy into a direct confrontation. The Ariogaesus attempted several times to exploit their cavalry to strike the Roman units during marches or in moments of dispersion. In some cases they managed to inflict losses, especially on auxiliary troops and less protected convoys. However, these actions do not produce the desired effect. The Roman army, now prepared for this type of threat, reacts quickly, tightening formations, occupying favorable positions and preventing the enemy cavalry from fully exploiting their mobility. One of the most significant aspects of the clashes of 174 is the role of the Roman generals in the field. The legates and subordinate commanders act with a margin of autonomy that reflects the trust placed in them by Marcus Aurelius. On several occasions, it is precisely the quick decisions of these officers that avoid potentially dangerous situations, transforming ambushes into opportunities for counterattacks. The sources do not always hand down the names and details of these actions, but their overall effect is evident. The Roman army moves like a coordinated organism, capable of adapting to circumstances without losing cohesion. The clashes of 174 do not only produce immediate military results, but have long-term strategic consequences. Every battle won, every incursion repelled, reinforces the perception that Rome is now able to control the pace of the war. Barbarians, on the other hand, see their options progressively reduced. Attempting a direct confrontation carries the risk of a devastating defeat. Avoiding combat means leaving room for the Roman advance and the construction of new fortifications. This dilemma paralyzes the enemy's initiative and favors a war of attrition that works to the empire's advantage. In some cases, the clashes take on an almost symbolic character. Small groups of warriors attempt desperate attacks against well-defended Roman outposts, perhaps in an attempt to demonstrate that the resistance is not yet broken. These episodes, although dramatic, invariably end in favor of the Romans, who manage to repel the assaults with limited losses. The repetition of such failures contributes to undermining the morale of the barbarians and strengthening the increasingly widespread belief that the war is coming to an end. From the Roman point of view, 174 is also the year in which the art of counter-guerrilla warfare was perfected. The legions, supported by local scouts and informants, learned to predict the enemy's movements, cut off escape routes, and hit the rear. In this context, even minor clashes take on a disproportionate value compared to their size. An ambush foiled, a column saved, a village neutralized can have a decisive impact on the overall balance of the front. The balance of the clashes of 174, despite the absence of precise figures, appears clearly favorable to Rome. The Roman losses, although not negligible, did not compromise the operational capacity of the army, while the barbarian losses increasingly affected the social and military structure of the tribes involved. Each fallen warrior represents a resource that is difficult to replace. Each lost leader is a blow to internal cohesion. This imbalance, which is accentuated from month to month, is one of the elements that allow us to understand why, at the end of the year, the empire can look to the future with unprecedented confidence. In 174 AD, therefore, the war was fought in a myriad of clashes which, taken individually, might seem marginal, but which taken together build a progressive and almost inexorable victory. It is a less flashy war than the great campaigns of the past, but perhaps more effective, because it is based on continuity, discipline, and the ability to transform every armed contact into a strategic advantage. In this network of battles, rapid decisions, and cumulative consequences, the maturity of the Roman army and the solidity of the imperial leadership are fully manifested, preparing the ground for the final balance of a year which, without sensational proclamations, marks one of the most favorable moments of the entire Danube War. When 174 AD came to an end, the Danube front presented a profoundly different face from the one Rome had known only a few years earlier. There is no formal act that marks the end of the operations, no solemn announcement that declares the war over, but all the political, military, and psychological elements converge towards the same impression. The empire is close to a victory that is not only military, but structural. The organized resistance of the main barbarian groups has been broken, their capacity for initiative drastically reduced, and above all, Roman control is no longer limited to the defense of the traditional border, but extends steadily beyond the Danube. The military budget for the year is clearly favorable to Rome. The legions maintain full operational efficiency, despite the hardships of a long and complex campaign, while the enemy forces appear worn out, fragmented, incapable of reconstituting a credible coalition. The Roman losses, although present, do not compromise the overall strength of the army, thanks to careful management of human resources and a rotation of units that limits wear and tear. On the contrary, for the barbarian populations, each fallen weighs disproportionately, affecting not only the military strength, but also the social structure and prestige of the remaining leaders. From a strategic point of view, the most significant result of 174 is not so much the defeat of individual enemies, but the imposition of a new balance. The barbarians no longer fight to conquer Roman territories, but to survive within an increasingly restricted space, monitored and conditioned by the imperial presence. The network of outposts, the mobile columns, the control of the communication routes have transformed the theater of war into a hostile environment for anyone attempting to oppose Rome without a solid and coordinated structure. The war, which in the past had taken on the characteristics of a continuous emergency, now appears to be under control, governed according to times and methods decided from above. Marcus Aurelius emerges, at the end of the year, as the main architect of this transformation. His action was not limited to the conduct of military operations, but affected the very nature of the conflict. The emperor demonstrated a rare ability to combine prudence and determination, avoiding both defensive inertia and adventurism. His presence on the front, constant and visible, strengthened the bond with the army and consolidated the authority of the supreme command. In 174, Marcus Aurelius is not only the victorious commander, but the guarantor of an order that is taking shape. It is in this context that the increasingly concrete idea of a profound reorganization of the Danube space matures. Rome begins to seriously consider the possibility of creating new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, which would move the border of the empire across the river. This is not an improvised project or the result of temporary enthusiasm, but the logical consequence of what has been built in the field. The advanced military structures, the stable presence of troops, the control of local populations make this prospect plausible. The empire, for the first time after years of defensive war, can afford to think in terms of controlled expansion and lasting peace. This vision does not imply the illusion that every problem is solved. Marcus Aurelius is perfectly aware of the fragility of the balance he has just achieved. The barbarian populations were not annihilated, but subdued. Their submission will require time, vigilance, integration, and deterrence capabilities. However, the very fact that the empire can address these problems from a position of strength represents a historical turning point. In 174, Rome no longer fights to repel an immediate threat, but to decide how to organize a space that it now feels is its own. Even on a symbolic level, the year leaves a profound mark. The Seventh Imperial Acclamation, the capture of important enemy figures, the continuity of operations without internal crises strengthen the image of a firm and legitimate power. This message spreads far beyond the battlefield, reaching the provinces and the capital itself. In an era in which imperial stability can never be taken for granted, 174 offers Rome a positive narrative, based on concrete facts and not on promises. There is no shortage of episodes in the sources that convey the human dimension of this moment. It tells of exhausted but confident soldiers, of commanders who begin to talk about the future with a different language, less marked by urgency and more by planning. They are fragmentary anecdotes, but revealing of a climate that is changing. The war, although not over, no longer dominates every thought as an imminent threat. It becomes a tool, a means to achieve a stable structure. At the end of 174 AD, Rome seemed very close to a total victory. Not in the sense of a definitive annihilation of enemies, but as a lasting affirmation of an imperial order beyond the traditional border. The Danube, from a line of defense, has transformed into a starting point. The Marcomannic War, at least as it presents itself in this crucial year, now appears to be channeled towards a favorable conclusion. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and commander, led the empire up to this point with silent determination, building step by step the conditions for a peace that is not just the absence of war, but the result of conscious domination. In 174, this peace was not yet a reality, but for the first time it appeared possible, founded on solid foundations, forged in the long and tiring confrontation on the Danube border.